12,000 years ago, someone carved a bag into solid stone, not a random shape. A bag with a rigid body and a curved handle held in the hand of a being that should not have existed according to everything we thought we knew about ancient history. And here is the part that will keep you up tonight. That exact same bag, the same shape, the same grip, shows up again and again on 3 different continents, carved by people who never met each other, who never traded with each other, who had no way of copying each other's art. And in every single carving, across 12,000 years, nobody ever shows what is inside. Not once. Stay with me for the next few minutes, because by the end of this video, you are going to look at ancient art completely differently. Let's start with the place that broke archaeology. Southeastern Turkey, a quiet hilltop that local farmers walked over for generations without knowing what was underneath their feet. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt started digging there at a site called Gobekli Tepe. What he found did not just add a new site to the history books. It forced historians to rewrite the opening chapter of human civilization. Gobekli Tepe is more than 11,000 years old, and some of its oldest structures are pushing 12,000 years. Read that number again. 12,000 years. That is roughly 7,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt. That is before writing, before pottery, before the wheel, before permanent farming villages, according to the old timeline anyway. The accepted model of human history said that people needed farming in settled towns before they could organize enough manpower to build massive stone monuments. Gobekli Tepe broke that model completely, because these were supposedly hunter-gatherer bands, and yet they carved and raised T-shaped limestone pillars weighing many tons, arranged in circular enclosures, decorated with detailed images of foxes, scorpions, vultures, snakes, and strange human-like figures. Klaus Schmidt himself said something that flipped the standard story upside down. He suggested that religion did not come after civilization. Religion, or at least large-scale communal ritual, might have come first, and civilization was built around it. Think about that for a second. A shared belief system pulling people together to build something enormous, long before farming, gave them a reason to settle down. But here's the detail that most documentaries skip over, and it is the one that matters most for this story. Around 10,000 years ago, the people who built Gobekli Tepe did something strange. They buried it, on purpose. They filled the enclosures with rubble and soil and covered the whole complex, as if they wanted to protect it, or hide it, or seal it away from whatever was coming. Think about the scale of what they built. Some of these limestone pillars stand over 5 meters tall and weigh more than 10 tons each. Moving stones that size, shaping them with the tools available at the time, and arranging them into precise circular patterns would have required dozens, maybe hundreds, of people working together over long periods, all fed, housed, and organized without the benefit of farming to support them. That alone tells us these were not scattered, disorganized bands of wanderers. They had leadership, planning, and a shared purpose, strong enough to pull large groups together for a common project. And the fact that they later chose to bury the whole thing on purpose, rather than let it fall apart naturally through neglect, tells us they cared about what happened to it even after they stopped using it. And among the carvings on those buried pillars is a shape that keeps showing up throughout this story. A container with a defined, rigid body and a curved handle on top. Carried in the hand of a figure. This is the object some researchers now call the handbag of the gods, and Gobekli Tepe is the earliest place we know of where it appears. Now, let's jump forward roughly 7,000 years, to a completely different civilization in a completely different place. Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now Iraq. This is where the Sumerians built the first cities, developed the first writing system, and left behind thousands of clay tablets describing their laws, their trade, their stories, and their gods. Buried inside Sumerian mythology is a group of beings that most people outside of ancient history circles have never heard of. They are called the Apkallu. According to Sumerian and later Babylonian texts, the Apkallu were not regular humans. They were described as wise sages sent to teach humanity the basics of civilization after a great flood destroyed the world that came before. Writing, mathematics, farming, architecture, law. According to these ancient texts, the Apkallu handed all of it to humanity. In Mesopotamian art, the Apkallu are shown in a few different forms. Some are winged human figures in ceremonial robes, some have the heads of eagles on human bodies, and some are shown as fishmen, part fish, part human at the same time. That last version connects to one of the strangest figures in ancient mythology, a being called Owans. A Babylonian priest named Berossus, writing in Greek around 278 BCE but drawing on much older Sumerian sources, described Owans in surprisingly specific detail. He had the body of a fish, but underneath the fish head was a human head. He had human feet coming out from under the fish tail. During the day, Owans came out of the sea onto dry land and taught people writing, geometry, farming, city planning, and law. At night, he went back into the water. That is an oddly precise description for a myth. It almost reads like someone trying to describe something real using the only comparisons they had available. Berossus was not the only source either. Fragments of his work were later quoted by other ancient writers, and depictions matching this fishman description show up on Assyrian palace reliefs and small carved figurines recovered from sites across Mesopotamia, spanning many centuries. Whatever the original idea behind Oannes was, it clearly stuck around in the culture for an extremely long time, passed down carefully instead of fading out like a random invented story usually would. Here is the detail that connects Oannes and the Apkallu directly to Gobekli Tepe. In nearly every depiction of these teacher figures across Mesopotamian art, spanning thousands of years, in throne rooms, temple carvings, and cylinder seals, they are shown holding the exact same object, a structured container with a curved handle. In their other hand, they often hold a cone-shaped object, which mainstream archaeology interprets as a tool for applying ritual liquid, like water or oil. The standard explanation is called the bandudu, a ceremonial bucket used in purification rituals. And to be fair, this explanation is not made up out of nowhere. Water and oil purification rituals really were a major part of Mesopotamian religious life, and some cylinder seals really do show scenes that look like purification ceremonies. If we were only looking at Mesopotamia, the bucket theory would be a reasonable, boring, and probably correct answer. First, the beings holding this object are not ordinary priests performing a water ritual. They are the Apkallu, the exact beings credited with founding civilization itself in Sumerian belief. Would the figures remembered for giving humanity writing, math, and law really be remembered, generation after generation, for carrying a water bucket? Second, the shape does not really match a bucket. Ancient depictions of actual buckets usually show a wide open top because you need to see and access the liquid inside. What the Apkallu carry has a closed, rigid, structured shape, built for carrying something safely, not for pouring liquid out. Third, and this is the part that really breaks the simple explanation, the same object shows up in places where Mesopotamian religion could not possibly have reached. And that brings us back to Gobekli Tepe, 7,000 years before Sumerian civilization even existed, where this same handled container is already carved into the stone. If it started as a Sumerian ritual bucket, how did it end up on a hilltop in Turkey thousands of years before Sumer was founded? And it does not stop there. This is where the story crosses an ocean. In the Mexican state of Veracruz, at the ancient Olmec site of La Venta, there's a carved stone monument known as Stela 19. It dates back roughly 3,000 years. It shows a standing figure in elaborate ceremonial dress, interacting with a feathered serpent, one of the most important symbols in Mesoamerican religion, the same symbolic figure that would later become Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya. And in his hand, that figure is holding an object that looks remarkably like the same handled container. The Olmec civilization is widely considered the founding culture of Mesoamerica. Their writing systems, their calendar, their architecture, all developed on their own, with no credible evidence of any direct contact with the ancient Middle East. These were two civilizations, separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years, that had no realistic way of copying each other's symbols. Now, the standard scientific response to all of this is coincidence. Different cultures around the world sometimes land on similar symbols independently, purely by chance. That is a fair point, and it happens. But coincidence usually produces variation. If separate cultures independently invented a handled container symbol by accident, you would expect it to mean different things in different places. A trade symbol here, a farming tool there, a random decoration somewhere else. Instead, in every culture where this object shows up, the context is nearly identical. It is always held by a divine or semi-divine figure. It is always connected to the origin of knowledge. It is always tied to the moment civilization was supposedly handed to humanity. The pattern gets even stranger when you look beyond Mesopotamia and Mesoamerica. In Maori tradition from New Zealand, there is a myth about the god Tain, who climbs up to the highest heaven and brings back 3 baskets containing different categories of sacred knowledge. Once again, a divine figure, a container, and knowledge being delivered to humanity, showing up on the opposite side of the planet with no realistic route of cultural contact. So the real question researchers actually argue about is this: what did people believe was inside it? And to be completely honest with you, nobody knows for certain. What we have are theories, some more grounded in evidence than others. Let's go through the most talked about ones, and I'll be straight with you about which ones are solid and which ones are speculation. Another theory, and again this is speculation rather than established fact, connects to origin myths from multiple cultures where gods are described as shaping or forming early humans, not just teaching them. Sumerian creation stories describe humans being formed from clay combined with something divine. Similar shaping myths appear in other ancient cultures around the world. Some researchers wonder if these stories are symbolic memories of something else entirely, and whether the container held tools tied to that story. Again, there is no physical evidence for this. It lives entirely in the realm of interpretation and myth analysis. Now here's a question almost nobody talks about. If this symbol was so important, so sacred, appearing constantly in the earliest layers of human art, why did it eventually fade away? It shows up prominently at Gobekli Tepe. It shows up constantly throughout early Mesopotamian civilization. It shows up in early Mesoamerican art. And then, over time, later civilizations stopped depicting it with anything close to the same frequency or importance. Something that was once central to how humans pictured divine knowledge slowly disappears from the record. The simplest explanation is also the least dramatic one. As civilizations changed, so did their religious symbols and priorities. Cultures evolve, art styles shift, older symbols get replaced by newer ones tied to whatever gods or rulers were dominant at the time. That is normal cultural change, and it happens constantly throughout history with all kinds of symbols, not just this one. But there is a more human explanation too, one that does not require aliens or lost super civilizations. As organized religions and ruling priesthoods consolidated power across Mesopotamia, Egypt, and later the Mediterranean world, older traditions that credited outside teachers, ancestors, or foreign figures with founding civilization often got pushed aside in favor of stories that centered the ruling religion's own gods and kings. This kind of religious and political rewriting happened constantly throughout history. Sacred texts and records were destroyed for political reasons more than once. The burning and looting of the Library of Alexandria across several centuries wiped out an enormous amount of ancient writing. In 1562, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa burned a large collection of Maya bark paper books, an act he later partly regretted and documented himself, destroying irreplaceable pre-Columbian records. So the idea that older symbols and stories can be deliberately pushed out of the historical record is not far-fetched at all. It has happened, repeatedly, and it is well documented. Even within Mesopotamia itself, later Babylonian and Assyrian rulers reworked older Sumerian myths to center their own preferred gods, sometimes renaming characters, sometimes shifting who gets credit for which achievement. Religious and political rewriting was simply a normal part of how ancient power worked, in the same way modern institutions today shape which parts of history get taught and which parts get quietly left out of the textbook. This is where the boldest theory comes in, the one mainstream archaeology does not officially endorse, but one that a growing amount of evidence makes harder to completely dismiss. What if the figures shown carrying this container were not meant to represent gods in a supernatural sense at all? What if they were meant to represent survivors? Survivors of an earlier human civilization that existed before the end of the last ice age, and that reached a level of organization the standard historical timeline does not currently account for. The evidence supporting the idea that something significant happened around this time period has genuinely grown over the last few decades. Gobekli Tepe alone proved that large-scale, organized construction existed at least 12,000 years ago, far earlier than experts used to think possible. Underwater surveys off the coasts of India, Japan, and parts of the Mediterranean have documented submerged structures at depths consistent with coastlines that existed before sea levels rose after the Ice Age, when huge amounts of water were locked in glaciers and sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. Geologist Robert Schoch, known for his controversial analysis of water erosion patterns on the Great Sphinx of Giza, has argued for years that the erosion pattern suggests a much older date for the monument than the traditional timeline allows, an idea most Egyptologists reject, but one that keeps the broader debate alive. Climate science tells us something important here too, and this part is well established, not speculative. The end of the Ice Age was not a slow, gentle warming. It came in sudden, dramatic bursts, rapid temperature swings, massive flooding events, and ecosystem collapse that would have been genuinely devastating for any human community living through it, advanced or not. There's a growing body of geological evidence, including unusual platinum levels, microscopic diamonds, and shocked quartz found in sediment layers, dated to roughly 12,800 years ago, that has led some scientists to propose what is called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. This theory suggests a fragmenting comet or asteroid may have struck the ice sheet covering North America and triggered a chain of environmental disasters. I need to be clear that this hypothesis is genuinely debated within the scientific community itself. Not universally accepted, but it is a real scientific hypothesis discussed in real peer-reviewed research, not internet fiction. If something like that did happen, it would line up almost exactly with flood myths found in cultures all over the world, and with the timing of major changes at Gobekli Tepe. Under this framework, the handbag becomes a symbol of what was saved. Survivors of a devastating global event carrying whatever knowledge, tools, or resources they managed to preserve, bringing it to scattered communities across a damaged world and teaching them how to rebuild. Those survivors, showing up with capabilities and knowledge far beyond what local populations had at the time, could easily have been remembered afterward as divine beings, gods who came from the sea, gods who descended from the sky, simply because the people who met them had no other framework to explain what they were seeing. And now here's the part of this story that connects directly to right now, to us, today. The symbol is always held by beings associated with technology and knowledge transfer. Writing, mathematics, agriculture, architecture, law. Every one of these was, in its own time, the cutting-edge technology of human civilization. Writing was once as revolutionary as artificial intelligence is today. Advanced agriculture was once as world-changing as gene editing is now. If ancient stories really do preserve some distorted memory of an earlier civilization, sharing powerful knowledge with the people who survived a global catastrophe, then the closed bag, the object nobody ever depicted the inside of, might represent something deeper than just physical objects. It might represent controlled knowledge, powerful capability handed over carefully, deliberately, without the full blueprint attached. Think about where we are right now. We are building artificial intelligence systems more capable than anything in recorded history. We are editing the genetic code of living things directly. We are developing energy technologies that would have seemed like pure fantasy only a century ago. We are, by almost any measure, more technologically powerful than any civilization we know of in the historical record. If any part of these old stories reflects something real, even in a distorted, mythologized form, then the pattern they describe is worth paying attention to. Powerful knowledge given to humanity after a catastrophe. Powerful knowledge that could rebuild a civilization, or, if handled carelessly, potentially help end one. Nobody can prove that connection. I want to be completely honest about that, because it deserves honesty. What we do have, provable and documented, is a symbol carved into stone at Gobekli Tepe more than 12,000 years ago, deliberately buried by the people who built it. The same shaped object held by the teacher figures of Sumerian mythology thousands of years later. The same shape again in Olmec carvings in Mexico 3,000 years ago, on the opposite side of the planet, with no known cultural contact between these civilizations. And in every single depiction, across 12,000 years and 3 continents, nobody ever showed what was inside. That part is not speculation. That part is simply true, and it is genuinely strange, whatever the ultimate explanation turns out to be. Maybe it really was a seed vault, humanity's first attempt at preserving the future after nearly losing everything. Maybe it was a symbol of knowledge itself, something too important and too dangerous to depict carelessly. Maybe the real answer is something no one has thought of yet, still waiting to be uncovered in a site not yet excavated, on a coastline not yet surveyed, in a text not yet translated. So here's my question for you. What do you think was really inside it? A seed vault that let humanity start over? A symbol of knowledge too powerful to draw carelessly? Or something we genuinely have not figured out yet? Drop your theory in the comments, because after 12,000 years of silence, this mystery still belongs to whoever is curious enough to keep asking the question. And if this kind of story pulls you in, stick around, because ancient history is full of details just like this one, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice.